Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
So for this explainer, we're diving into Assata Shakur's autobiography. But here's the thing. We're not just looking at it as a story. Think of it more like a map that shows how these massive carceral institutions are designed to shape our perception and define what's legitimate, not just to hand out punishment.
All right, let's get right into it. We have to start with the author and the subject herself, Assata Shakur. Her life is really defined by this huge, stark contrast, you know? There's the official narrative the state tells about her, and then there's the one she tells.
And her autobiography, well, it isn't just a slightly different story. It's a direct counter-narrative, which really forces you to stop and ask a pretty fundamental question. How is it even possible for two completely opposite perceptions of the same person to exist at the very same time?
And right here, you can see those two competing realities laid out, side by side. On one hand, you have the official labels, fugitive, terrorist, the FBI's most wanted woman. But then, on the other hand, her book tells a totally different story. It's about a life shaped by racism from childhood, about a political awakening, and about a head-on collision with what she calls systemic oppression.
So, how does this happen? How are these two completely different perceptions not only created, but kept alive? To really get our heads around that, we need a core idea, a central metaphor for the entire system we're talking about.
And this is really the key insight of the book. It argues that the whole carceral system, it functions like a powerful lens. It doesn't just show us what's there. No, it actually bends and refracts public perception. It's this lens that determines who we see as dangerous, who gets to be seen as legitimate, and, who is ultimately seen as disposable.
Okay, so if it's a lens, how does it actually work? Let's break down the mechanics of this system. Let's look at the patterns of control that literally shape what we see, and maybe more importantly, what we don't see.
Now, the book makes it clear this isn't just one thing. It's more like a whole interconnected ecosystem. You've got the institutional design itself, some really powerful economic incentives, constant reinforcement from the media, and of course the legal frameworks that kind of glue the whole thing together.
And for Shakur, this awareness started way back in childhood. She actually traces her understanding of systemic injustice to her school days. She talks about the difference between the obvious, in-your-face racism of segregated schools in the South, and then the much more subtle, and in some ways more confusing, biases she ran into in the so-called integrated schools up north.
So that institutional design, it's held up by a very specific legal framework. And a huge piece of that puzzle, as Shakur points out, is the 13th Amendment itself. The one that abolishes slavery. Except, and this is a massive exception, as a punishment for a crime.
And that one little clause, that constitutional loophole, according to Shakur, it creates these massive economic incentives. It's what turns prisons into what she calls a profitable business. It basically becomes a way to legally continue a system of forced, unpaid labor.
Then you've got the media, which comes in and reinforces this entire structure. Shakur's argument is that the court of public opinion, well, it convenes and reaches a verdict long before anyone ever steps foot in an actual courtroom. The verdict is pretty much decided in our minds through newspapers and television.
So what's the end result of all this working together? It creates this incredibly powerful narrative of fear and division. It works to isolate individuals, to turn them into, as she says, horrible and hideous monsters in the public eye. And when that happens, it's pretty much impossible for any bigger, systemic critiques to really take hold.
So, in the face of all that systemic pressure to be seen as a monster, how do you fight back? How do you resist? Well, the book offers one answer: poetry. It's used as a powerful tool of resistance, a way to try and reclaim your own humanity when the system is doing everything it can to control how you're perceived.
And this brings us right back to the core problem, doesn't it? The real power of this system, the reason it keeps going, is that it relies on our inability to see all the pieces connected, to see it as a whole.
Which makes you wonder, right? Why do we get so focused on isolated cases, on the sensational headlines, on one single enemy at a time? The book's argument is that this isn't some accident. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature.
Because think about it, when you isolate people and events, all those larger patterns connecting them, the institutional design we talked about, the economic incentives, those legal loopholes, they all just fade into the background. They become invisible. And that right there, that is the crisis in perception.
So what's the takeaway here? If we look at Assata's autobiography through this systems-level view, what does that actually change for us? How does it change how we see things?
Well, for one, it completely reframes how we think about incarceration. It stops being just a simple tool for punishment. Instead, you start to see it as this complex, powerful machine that is actively deciding who gets to be seen as legitimate in our society and who is seen as disposable. And in the end, the book's argument is that this story, it isn't just about one person. It's about the systems that shape how all of us see the world. And it leaves us with this idea that the fight over perception, well, that might be just as important as any legal or political battle out there.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.